started. Welcome again, everyone. We're really glad you've joined us for this Palestine teach-in. And so I'm going to share my screen real quick. This program was sponsored by the Asian American Democrats of Texas, the Texas Progressive Caucus, and the Muslim Democratic Caucus. We're really glad you've joined us for a look at the history of war on Palestine, peace in the Middle East, the international law background of what's going on, and what it means for Texas and Texas politics next year. So these are the sponsoring organizations. We do have a quick poll for you. Clayton, are you able to run the poll, or do you need me to stop sharing? So this poll is anonymous. It's just to see as a whole where the audience is in terms of your feelings on the issues.
And the poll is multiple choice, so you can pick multiple answers.
Meantime, while we're getting through that poll post, sorry, I went too far back. Here's a quick look at our agenda. We're going to start with our first speaker, Brother Imad Salam. He was going to talk from a personal experience perspective, what occupation has been like, the history of Palestine from a Palestinian perspective. Then Professor Ben Fleming will discuss the legal background and how to analyze the situation from the perspective of international humanitarian law. Then last, Clayton Tucker from the Texas Progressive Caucus will give us an analysis of what the impact of this issue could be on the 2024 elections, especially in areas where Muslim voter turnout is especially important. How's everyone doing on that poll, Clayton?
It looks like we have 29 folks have taken it. The 65% of folks are familiar with the situation and 20% are not familiar. So hopefully by the time we are done today, 100% of folks will feel very familiar with the situation. So thank you everyone for taking that poll. And I'll pass it back to you, Nikki.
Thank you. So our first speaker, I'll go straight to you. Brother Imad Salam is currently a realtor in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He is the vice president of the Texas Progressive Caucus, a former SGC member, and a former president of Muslim Democratic Caucus of Texas. And he's originally Palestinian. So I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Nikki. First, let me start by thanking everyone for being here and thanking the Asian American Democrats of Texas, the Texas Progressive Caucus, and the Muslim Democratic Caucus for hosting this event. At the same time, I want to thank them for their due diligence, for their hard work that made the Texas Democratic Party sponsor a resolution to call for a ceasefire. This made Texas #1 in the nation, the first state party to pass a resolution calling on a ceasefire. The first thing is a quick statement that I like what Jewish Voice for Peace put out the day right after the October 7th, says, as the news of violence and loss of Palestinian and Israeli life unfolds, we must be clear. This is the direct result of decades of Israeli occupation, blockade, and apartheid over millions of Palestinians. The other Jewish organization that I would like to quote is If Not Now. And they said in one of their statements, the tragedies of the past month have made it clearer than ever. If we want a future where Palestinians and Israelis live with safety and freedom, we need a strong movement of Americans demanding our government stop fanning the flames of war. We need to work nonstop to pressure President Biden and Congress to save Palestinian and Israeli lives by demanding a lasting ceasefire. This conflict did not start on October 7th. It has been going for over 100 years. Since we started planning this event, I was hoping that the war on Gaza would be ended or stopped before this event. Unfortunately, because of the Biden administration vetoed the ceasefire resolution at the United Nations Security Council, the genocide in Gaza continues until now. Just looking at the pictures coming out of Gaza, you see women and children fleeing the war. It brings back memories of what happened to me and my family in 1967. I am a Palestinian refugee. On June 7th, 1967, I was at home with my mom, grandma, my sister, and my two younger brothers when the Israeli army jeeps rolled into Beit Likia, Ramallah district in the West Bank. They pointed their machine guns on us and said, "Leave or you will die." We were scared. My dad was working in Amman, Jordan at the time, so my mom and my grandma had to make that hard decision to stay and take the risk of being shot by the Israeli army or run away and risk losing our home, land, and everything that we owned. My mom was worried that what has happened in 1948 will happen again, when 750,000 Palestinians were either forced from their homes or run away because of the war. They were never allowed to go back to their homes. That is what Palestinians call Nakba or catastrophe. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and the Israeli policy of not allowing the 750,000 Palestinian refugees to return to their home. My mom made that decision, and we rode on the back of a pickup truck to the border between Palestine and Jordan. We had to walk across the destroyed Alembi Bridge over the Jordan River. Then we got another ride to a Palestinian camp called Ashuna. We stayed there for 2 months. Then we moved to another refugee camp, An-Nasser refugee camp, which is in Amman, Jordan, which was more of a permanent camp. I lived there for 11 years until I came to this country in 1978. I was one of the lucky few who managed to leave the camp. Tens of thousands still live there until now and waiting to return to their homes in Palestine one day. My family was determined to return at the first opportunity. That opportunity happened in 1993 after the Oslo Agreement between Israel and the PLO. My mom and my dad, sisters and brothers went to Palestine in 1993, stayed there until they regained their Palestinian identity card, and they lived there. My dad passed away 4 years ago, but my mom and my sisters are still living in Beit Likia in the West Bank. I go visit them straight from the US with an American passport, and I am given a visitor's visa. Even though I was born in Palestine, I carry a Palestinian birth certificate, and I own property in Palestine, but still I am treated as a tourist because of the Israeli military occupation. Now to the history of the occupation. I will share my screen with you. So those are the refugees. Those are the people who have been running away from one place to another place in Gaza. Either they run away because of the war or because the Israeli army asked them to move. I see myself as one of those kids holding a bag and running away with his mom. This is the refugee camp in Amman, Jordan, where I lived for 11 years. To the history of the military occupation of Palestine. This is Palestine. The map on the left is Palestine before 1948. the country was under the Ottoman Empire until 1918, when the Ottoman Empire lost the First World War. After that, it became under the British mandate. That's what the League of Nations called it, or it is the British colonization. At the time, it was 80% Palestinian Muslims, about 10 to 12% Palestinian Christians, 5% Jewish people, and maybe 1 or 2% Druze. Those are the four religions in Palestine. Everyone spoke Arabic. They all consider themselves Palestinians, and they all living together in peace and harmony until the Zionist organization started asking Jewish European settlers to move to Palestine. The problem started in the early 1920s, and fighting started between Palestinians and the European colonizers until 1948. That's when Britain announced they will be leaving Palestine. On May 15th, 1948, that's when the British forces left Palestine. Now, the issue went to the United Nations multiple times, and as we could see on the second map on the left, the United Nations decided to partition Palestine. They have given about 56% to the Jewish people and 44% to the Palestinian Muslims and Christians. The green is the Palestinian areas, the white is the Jewish settler areas. So in 1948, the war started on May 15th, and at the end of the war, the Israeli state was created, and they took over 78% of the land, as we could see on the third map. The green area on the right is the West Bank, and the slight enclave on the left is the Gaza Strip. My parents and myself, we used to live in the West Bank in a village called Beit Likia next to Ramallah. So both areas became under, the West Bank became under the control of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip became under the control of Egypt from 1948 until 1967. In 1967, the Six-Day War started, and the Israeli army conquered the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Desert from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. We go to the last map, and this is something that Trump projected plan, which he wants to divide the West Bank into small controlled areas by the Palestinians, the Bantustans. This has never happened, but until now, those areas are divided because of the Israeli army. So when we talk about occupation, the military occupation of Palestine, what does that mean? First, it means confiscating lands. The Israeli army issues military orders. Military orders means you lost your land. So any land they want in the West Bank and Gaza until 2000, in the West Bank currently going on until now, but Gaza Strip has a different situation. We'll talk about it in a second. So in the West Bank, anytime the Israeli army could issue a military order to confiscate your land, that land is gone. If you want to sue, you could go and sue to the Supreme Court, Israeli Supreme Court. It'll probably take 2, 3, 4 years. And at the end, they will give you some kind of a judgment that says you have the right to your land unless the Israeli army does not allow that. So you lost your land. There are currently 150 settlements in the West Bank. So the Israeli government has been encouraging Israeli citizens to move to the West Bank. A lot of times, or most of the time, they would confiscate lands and they would build settlements on. There are 150 settlements and there are 128 outposts. Currently, over 700,000 Israeli settlers live in the West Bank. The second thing about occupation is the stolen water resources. The Israeli governments take control over all the water resources underground and above ground. The water either diverted to Israel proper or to the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. The Israeli government, the third point, the Israeli government controls all entry and exit into the West Bank. There are travel restrictions. To go for Palestinians to go to Jerusalem to pray, you have to have a special permit. No one is allowed to travel into Israel itself unless you have a military issued permit. Palestinians cannot travel to Gaza. From the West Bank to Gaza, neither way, this is a no-go land. The fourth thing about the occupation, there are roadblocks or checkpoints, which means you are at the mercy of an 18-year-old Israeli soldier carrying a machine gun. He has the right to let you through the checkpoint or not. And I have heard and seen multiple cases of Palestinian women, pregnant women, delivering babies in the back of a taxi cab at the checkpoint because they were not allowed to go to a hospital. In the last 5-6 years, there has been some daily night raids on Palestinian homes. The Israeli army has been terrorizing Palestinian kids. In the West Bank, there are no freedom of speech, no freedom of press, no elections. Any election that the Palestinians want to have, even local elections, must have the approval of the Israeli authorities. Lately, there have been a crackdown even on posts on social media. Administrative detention. That is a law that was used by the British colonization back in the 1920s, and Israel is using the same law, which means the Israeli army could arrest anyone from the West Bank with no trial, no indictments. You will be in jail for 6 months, and that 6 months period could be extended into multiple years. The Palestinians that are indicted, they face a criminal military law. The conviction law is, or the conviction rate is 99.7%. In the West Bank, there are separate roads for Palestinians, separate roads for Israelis. If a Palestinian were caught on those roads that he's not supposed to, a big possibility either being shot or being imprisoned for multiple years. Now let's take a look and so in 1948, there was the 750,000 Palestinian refugees who ran away or forced to leave. Again, in 1967, it happened. Those red dots you see, that's where all the Palestinian refugee camps are. So the yellow is Israel after 1948. On the left is the Gaza Strip. That's where all Palestinian camps, and the West Bank, in Jordan, in Syria, and in Lebanon. Before 1948, Palestine was divided into 17 districts, or what we call in the US counties. So those are 17 counties, and one of them is Gaza. And if you could see on the left here, the size of Gaza. We will go now to the Gaza Strip to see how this county has been reduced in size. At the moment, this is, or since 1950, this is how the Gaza Strip is. Now, Gaza has 2.3 million people. 75% of them are refugees. Those are refugees that ran away in 1948 and in 1967. The size of Gaza is about a third the size of the city of Dallas, but it has twice the population. So Gaza is one of the most densely populated area in the world. Because of the siege that Israel placed on Gaza after Hamas won the elections in 2006, Gaza has a 45% unemployment rate. People in Gaza, they cannot leave, they cannot go anywhere, because on one side it's the Mediterranean Sea, and there are Israeli warships here. On the north and on the east is the Israeli border, and there is multiple fences, and there is no way for anyone to cross over unless they have a permission to do so. On the south side, it is with Egypt, and also Egypt, there's a fence and there's a wall. So the Palestinians in Gaza is in what is called an open air prison. They can't go anywhere. They cannot run away. The sky is full of Israeli drones. That is when there is no war. If there is a war right now, it's full of F-16s. So you are trapped. It is a concentration camp because you can't go anywhere. In the last 15 years or so, there was 3 different wars when Israel attacked the Gaza Strip in 2008, 2009, in 2012, in 2014, in 2021, and currently in 2023. So that's where we are. And the last thing I want to show you is the map of the area. And right here on the left are the American warships, the aircraft carriers protecting Israel. And the third one is in the Red Sea. That's where we are right now. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Brother Imad, for both sharing your painful personal experiences with us and for that in-depth look at the history and geography of Palestine. We're all sending our best wishes and prayers for your family in the West Bank. I think we're going to leave some questions until the end. If you have a really pressing question, you can put it in the chat in the meantime, and we'll see if we can sneak it in. But for now, I'm going to go over to Professor Ben Fleming. He is currently Adjunct Professor of Public International Law and International Human Rights Law at South Texas College of Law, Houston. Prior to that, he was Associate Adjunct Professor of International Human Rights Law at SIPA, the Graduate School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He was a visiting lecturer in International Human Rights and Public International Law at Mandalay University School of Law in January and February 2014. He has worked extensively with the United Nations and was a legal officer in the Office of Co-Investigating Judges at the United Nations Khmer Rouge Tribunal in Phnom Penh, which I'm probably mispronounced, and I apologize for that, from 2006 to 2009. And he's also worked in the anti-corruption and litigation offices of the Open Society Justice Initiative. I'm going to hand it over to you for addressing the legal background and the law of armed conflict and how it applies to the situation.
A mouthful. Born and reared right here in Houston, Texas, though, so I am amongst friends and family. So thank y'all for being here, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. Perhaps by zooming out a little bit to take a broader picture, not because I want to take the focus away from Palestine, but rather to put a little context into the broader situation and why it matters to people like us joining in a room in Texas. When it works effectively, it's at the middle point between stability and progress. right now, it is achieving neither of those things. It is creating instability and inhibiting progress for the betterment of mankind. If we just look at what's known as the P5 alone, the P5 being the of the Security Council, Russia.
Professor, you're cutting in and out. Is there a way to adjust your audio?
That everything seems fine on my end.
Okay, you're back. We're good.
But in what we did not catch.
I think we lost you again. Do you think it would help to log out and log back in? And in the meantime, Brother Imad, could you take a couple of the questions in the chat? Yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you, Professor.
Which
Thank
question?
you, Professor. We'll see you back. One question brought up is how the general question I think is how do we know Gaza is the most densely populated place, one of the most densely populated in the world? And there's a link here to an article that explains that Gaza isn't, and that it's more similar to the density of London. And I'm actually not familiar with the source, but would you be able to explain to us how that density fact is determined?
Yes, absolutely. The density is measured by the number of people per square foot or per square miles. And I'm just comparing Irving, Texas to Gaza. Irving, Texas have a population of 250,000 people. The size of Gaza Strip is 140 square miles, which is twice the size of Irving. So if you compare them, Gaza has a population of probably 4 times the dense population of Irving. You could just compare the size. There are 2.3 million people living in Gaza, twice the size of Irving. So it's a very densely populated area. What was the other question, Nikki?
Thank you.
Yo.
Am I back?
Yes, we can hear you for now.
I'm terribly sorry. I don't know what happened. I'm not sure what you heard and what you did not hear, but I just wanted to zoom out quite quickly to look at the state of international law generally. At its best, when it's functioning, I said that international law is supposed to stand at the midpoint between stability and progress. And right now, given the state of the major players in the international community, the permanent 5 members of the UN, Russia, China, the UK, France, and the United States, we are seeing a situation where each state is picking and choosing which aspects of international law they wish to follow and which they don't. We have Russia breaking a cardinal norm by acquiring territory and invading Ukraine. We have China committing yet another genocide in Xinjiang against the Uyghur population. We have them also completely flouting their own commitments in the South China Sea. The UK is trying to shred the Refugee Convention and send refugees to camps in Rwanda. The United States veering towards totalitarianism, using the veto very quickly after announcing a new policy of not using the veto except for in very rare or special circumstances, amongst other things. And I don't know what France is up to, something squirrely, I'm sure. But when each of these P5 countries is dividing and tailoring international law, it's because they're not being held to account by their populations. And that's why we're here today, to help learn how and why we should be holding our governments to toe the line on international law, because they are commitments that serve everyone, not just the self-interests of leadership in whatever country one finds themselves. So what I'd like to talk about was international law, then one branch of international law, the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law, and then quickly run through some provisions of that as it pertains to Palestine, then look at crimes against humanity and genocide and what it means in the future for enforcement. It's a lot to cover in 15 or 20 minutes. I will try to say it as succinctly as I'm able to. So let's start with international humanitarian law, also known as the law of armed conflict. It's where we hear the words war crimes and where we hear the words grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. Words that we'll see frequently on the fronts of newspapers, but that very many people are unaware of their technical meanings. So what we have in Israel and Palestine right now is an international armed conflict. It's not a civil war. It's not an internal armed conflict. Now, Israel does not recognize Palestine as a state. For that matter, neither does the United States. However, over 139 other countries do. But even if Palestine was not recognized as an independent state, all occupations in international law serve as international armed conflicts. And this matters because when something is classified as an international armed conflict, the full slate of the law of armed conflict applies. And all belligerent sides, Hamas, Israel, are bound to the full slate of international law. Now, we often hear when we're looking at this issue, or when we're reading about it, we hear this refrain: Israel has the right to self-defense, to protect itself, especially following October 7th. This is undoubtedly true. They suffered an armed attack. What is also true is that the armed attack in response has to follow the rules of armed conflict. There are two branches to this rule. They have fancy words. The first is called jus ad bellum, and that simply means when it is lawful to engage in armed conflict. Self-defense is principally the only answer to that question, or when the UN Security Council authorizes it. When you say Israel has the right to self-defense, you are talking about the entitlement to engage in conflict, which is met because it was an armed attack was inflicted. However, the second branch of international humanitarian law is called the jus in bello, and that means the conduct of how you proceed in the armed conflict, what types of weapons you can use, the types of targets that you can hit, those types of questions. And the entire purpose, the primary purpose of this branch of international law is so that we do not have conversations about moral equivalency. It doesn't matter history, repugnance, the behavior of one side or another. Those things go out the window. The rules are clear at this point. Even if one side of the armed conflict breaks the law of armed conflict, that does not allow the other side to break the laws of armed conflict. So whether we're talking about Hamas, whether we're talking about the IDF, whether we're talking about ISIS or the Janjaweed in Sudan or any number of armed conflicts around the world, the behavior of those parties in no way changes what the IDF or Israel is allowed to do in their response. This goes both ways. So the law of armed conflict applies to both sides equally. It applies to Hamas. It applies to Israel and the IDF. What has happened in the past animates the political situation in Israel and Palestine. It does not have any bearing whatsoever on the law of armed conflict, what you are allowed to do and what you are not allowed to do. And so let's just briefly then go through what's happening in Palestine with respect to the IDF and how we interpret it from an international law perspective. When we're talking about war crimes or violations of the law of armed conflict, we have two different kinds. We have what are normal war crimes, which engage state responsibility, which means that the state has to provide reparations or can be held accountable through treaties, through monetary agreements, through sanctions, those types of things. And then we have grave breaches, which incur individual criminal responsibility for their violations. When we're looking at the behavior of the IDF in Palestine, the most important thing from an international law perspective is the principle of distinction. This is the part of the international law of armed conflict that protects civilians from attacks in international or non-international armed conflict. And distinction is principally understood through what we call the rules surrounding proportionality. This can sometimes be confusing because proportionality matters at the beginning and during the conflict. Proportionality matters if, for example, Mexico had a regiment invade Texas tomorrow. This is far-fetched, far-flung, I know, but if they did, and they killed 200 people in, across the border from Matamoros or something like that, that would be the beginning of an armed conflict. Now, it wouldn't be a very wise one on the part of Mexico. The United States would respond, but we would have to respond proportionately. We would not be able to, for example, drop an atomic weapon on Mexico City. That would be a disproportionate response. Now, we can argue about whether the full response of Israel on Palestine violates that first element of proportionality. But I would like to spend most of my time talking about proportionality during the actual response, each individual military strike made by the IDF in Israel. So here we're talking about the strikes that we read about in the newspaper, strikes on hospitals, strikes on schools, strikes on mosques, strikes on UN facilities, and other civilian, per se, civilian targets. Now, the rule on proportionality during the conduct of the war, because we've already established that Israel has the right to enter the armed conflict. Historically, we're not talking about who's right or wrong from a political standpoint. We're talking only about the right to engage in armed conflict. So we have to measure two things. For every single instance of the conflict, every military strike, every target struck, a reasonable commander is supposed to be determining the balancing act between military advantage and civilian harm. How we measure those two things is more of an art than a science because they're not rationally related. The law of war is very cold. It is very calculating, and it gives more weight traditionally to military advantage. The whole purpose of international law, my field, international human rights and humanitarian law, is to take that away, to put more emphasis on the humanitarian aspect and less emphasis on the military advantage. This is a slow and painful process, but it has been functioning over the last 75 to 100 years. So, what is it that they're not allowed to do? When you're striking a target, first of all, you have to demonstrate that it has become a military target. How has Israel been trying to accomplish this? By telling us that there's tunnels under every single building, under every single hospital. Now, that may or may not be the case in all of these circumstances. There's been evidence presented on two different sides. But once that is decided, yes, maybe it might become a military target. But that does not mean that you can just destroy that building because there's a tunnel underneath it, because it may or may not have been used. Because we also do not know how or why it was established. It does not make the civilians in that building collaborators or civilians taking active part in hostilities. It does not make them targetable from a military standpoint. So we're obligated to contrast and compare what is excessive in relation to the anticipated military benefit of each strike. We have to look and say, what are we immediately gaining from a military standpoint? And is it worth the destruction of however many civilians might die in the event of us gaining that military intervention? And this is not a holistic thing. It doesn't mean that this will help in the long run. It has to help immediately. It has to be validated in that balancing context each and every time. Now, if we look at what's happening, and these are all rough sort of numbers, we're talking about a 99.5% or higher civilian death rate in Palestine from all of the attacks since October 7th. So the IDF has come forward. The last statistic I heard was that they believe they'd killed somewhere in the range of 75 Hamas militants. And yet we're approaching 20,000 civilian deaths in Gaza. That puts us at less than a 1% hit rate. Now, an instance where one high-grade military target is killed and 100 civilians die may or may not, most often not, but it could possibly be validated under the rules of war. The idea that this could happen hundreds of times over is beyond laughable. It's not even worth having a straight face and trying to consider that discrepancy. Right now, the number of Hamas militants identified as killed by the IDF is about the same number of journalists who have been killed in Palestine. So you have a 1-to-1 on journalists and Hamas militants, and you have a 99-to-1 civilian to militant death rate. These numbers in the law of war actually are subordinate. The numbers, the statistics aren't actually what matters. But we have to somehow try to take the word of a military that each and every one of these strikes has been done with the idea of mitigating civilian deaths in relation to military advantage. I find that very difficult to I find it difficult to come to that conclusion. Now I am sitting a long way away, and I have to respect everybody has to respect that. I am not there, but it's implausible. So from a military advantage standpoint, first of all, there's 4 components we have to understand. First of all, it has to be military. You cannot kill civilians to demoralize the military. So killing civilians to demoralize Hamas, if that was some sort of goal, would be unlawful on its face. You cannot attack civilians in order to create military advantage. It has to have a military advantage itself, each strike. Now, it also has to be anticipated. So we're not talking about numbers afterwards, technically, but a reasonable commander has to look and say, here's a residential building with families living in it, and perhaps there is a target underneath it. Is the value of that target, does that outweigh the lives of all of the innocents above? And if we hit it with a precision weapon, is the building stable enough to withstand that, or is it going to collapse the building? Now, to find that over the last month and a half or however long it's been, that those calculations have been correct, that they've only killed 70 Hamas militants, but they've razed almost half of the Gaza Strip to the ground, makes it implausible again that each and every one of those was made by a reasonable commander, and it met this calculus. It also has to be direct and concrete, but I don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to skip a little bit forward out of that and try to perhaps skip over crimes against humanity as well and jump into this question of genocide, because it's all over social media, it's all over newspapers, and we need to understand intellectually what we're talking about. It's not a term of art. It is a legal term with a specific definition. In order to meet the idea of genocide, we have to commit an unlawful act. Those are generally killing, causing serious bodily injury, inflicting conditions on a civilian or on a population intended to physically destroy them, to prevent births, or to forcibly transfer children from one group to another. Those are by and large the types of things, but for our purposes, let's just talk about killing and serious bodily injury. Now, you have to do those things, but you also have to do them with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Now, I've said these words, and they might not mean very much conversationally, but from a legal standpoint, each one of those phrases has a specific meaning, and those would be what we would consider litigation points to find if we've met the legal definition of genocide or not. So, for example, let's say I'm here in Houston and I go out because for whatever reason, I hate Bolivians. I don't like Bolivian people. So I go out and I shoot every Bolivian I can find in Houston. Have I committed genocide? The answer to that is no. Now, that might be confusing for some, but it's because it hasn't met the very strict legal definition. I haven't killed them to destroy that group. The discriminatory intent is not enough. I have to want to destroy the entire group as such. So just killing as many as I can find is not the same as going about and removing them from the face of the earth. Now, what I did, if it's part of a plan or a larger policy where we're trying to destroy that group, then it could be a part of genocide because we're trying to rid that entire group from existence. Now, we also have the in whole or in part. We don't have to kill all of the Bolivians everywhere. We don't have to kill the entire diaspora or go to Bolivia and kill all the Bolivians there. It's enough to intend to destroy that national group as such in that place. So now, if we're looking at Palestine, these become very thorny issues. We also have to talk about two more issues. We have the idea of genocide as a crime that a person like you or me could be convicted of. And we have the idea of genocide that a state can be responsible for. Now, the United States, for example, has recognized genocides in Burma against the Rohingya, a Muslim group there. They have recognized the genocide in China, in Xinjiang province against the Uyghurs. So we know what it means from a state responsibility standpoint. They're saying China and Myanmar are responsible for the genocide of those groups. We have not come anywhere close to the criminal responsibility on those. There's no tribunal set up. There is the International Criminal Court, which is attempting to investigate the issue in Burma and Bangladesh. But that is where you get into trials, where you're talking about proving beyond a reasonable doubt the criminal responsibility of a person for ordering, committing, aiding and abetting, or some other form of liability for an actual act of genocide. When we're talking about it, is Israel committing genocide? That is a much lower standard of proof that is required for that demonstration. It is not beyond a reasonable doubt. So we have to look at the total facts about where is the intent? What is the intent of Israel and both its reaction to October 7th, but also its prior behavior with respect to the occupation of Palestine and its known or circumstantially obvious intentions. Now, if we look at the conduct of the military affair, we've already established that we have 99% civilian kill rate. We know that we have mass civilian deaths. We also know that borders are closed and there's no escape routes. We know that there's nowhere to run, that almost every civilian infrastructure that we know of has been deemed a military target by the reasonable commander of the IDF. We have statements, for example, by a Likud MP asking or saying that they want Gaza wiped from the face of the earth. We have the defense minister, Gallant, I think his name is, who called Palestinians human animals, that there is no such thing as a civilian in Gaza. There's 2.5 million terrorists. We have the fact that Bibi Netanyahu went to the UN a few months before October 7th and presented a map of Israel without the occupied territories demarcated, which is indicia that he wants them to no longer be there. Now, perhaps he could try to make the excuse that he wants a one-state solution as opposed to destroying the entire Palestinian population. But we have to put these things together. I think from a prima facie standpoint, we can look at what the US State Department has said with respect to Xinjiang in China and what the US State Department has said in Myanmar and look at the factual circumstances and say that these are not dissimilar cases. We can also compare and contrast, say, the occupation of Ukraine by the Russians and the occupation of Palestine by Israel. We can look at that and say, well, on one side, we're giving billions of dollars to prevent an occupation, and on the other side, we're giving $1 billion to perhaps buttress an unlawful occupation, at least the conduct of it that we've seen in the last 5 years. Now, I do want to also be very careful, especially when we're talking about the word genocide and state responsibility, to talk about that we don't essentialize what it means as Israel or the Israeli people. Ahmad brought up the two organizations, Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. The rules of armed conflict, many of which that I just talked about, are codified in treaties. Now, some of these treaties Israel has not ratified. That means they would not be governed by those rules of armed conflict, except that they have become rules of customary international law. And they are binding on Israel. And we know they are binding on Israel because Israel's Supreme Court itself has accepted that. Israel's Supreme Court has said, these rules are binding on us. The law of occupation that prevents the moving of settlers into occupied territory, the rules relating to civilian targeting in customary international law. This highlights too, perhaps, why Netanyahu was working so hard to destroy the Supreme Court, or to subordinate it to the parliament prior to October 7th. It also demonstrates that there is a huge faction of the Israeli population that is against settlerism, that is against the current war in Palestine, that wants a ceasefire, that wants a peaceful two-state solution. We would not, especially the, I guess, self-selective group here, to be associated with the policies of Trump. And I don't think it would be fair to equate the Israeli people with Likud or with Netanyahu and what they're trying to achieve. But if we don't, and this is hopefully how I can spin this off to Clayton, hold our leaders to account, then we will leave them to choose the self-serving portions of international law that they want to follow for their own benefit, rather than being consistent and responding to these humanitarian crises in a systematic and coherent manner. So I apologize for being in such a hurry after being cut off by the internet, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and I turn it over to you, Niloufar.
Oh, thank you for that. We're gonna go to Clayton to do his portion real quick, but first we had one question I think it might be helpful to answer now. So just to clarify, there are certain rules of international law that Israel, even though it hasn't signed on to the treaties that would apply that law to them, has kind of acceded to through customary international law. Could you tell us about if there's a specific legal definition of genocide and where it comes from that would apply to what Israel is doing?
Yes, so from the most relevant definition would be in the Rome Statute, which governs the International Criminal Court. I believe off the top of my head, if I recall, it's Article 4 or 5. And it'll tell you essentially what I just told you. It is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Now, as rightly said, Israel has not ratified the Rome Statute. They're not a member of the International Criminal Court. However, Palestine is. So anything that happens in Palestine can be under the jurisdiction of the ICC. So if evidence at a certain level, if there's enough evidence to create an indictment for criminal responsibility of an individual, maybe a high-level commander in Gaza that decided to raise a hospital or raise an apartment building, that person could be arrested and charged in that, even though Israel hasn't ratified that treaty, because it happened on Palestinian territory and Palestine has and is a recognized party to that. Now, they can't be arrested in Israel, but they may have, at least some of these may have created their own prisons. At this point, I think they would probably be safe to travel to the United States, but it might not be so safe to travel to Europe or any number of other places where they would be subject to arrest. The definition of genocide that we use in international law now for criminal responsibility is that of the Rome Statute. There is no lesser definition for state responsibility. It's the same definition. We just require less evidence to hold a state responsible for genocide than we do for criminals or individuals, because individuals we can put in jail, states we can't.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. So we'll come back to both you and Brother Imad for more questions at the end, but we do want to go over to Clayton for his portion on looking at the electoral impact. So Clayton Tucker is a former teacher, author, small business owner, and rancher. He is county chair for the Lampasas Democrats. He is the founder and president of the Texas Progressive Caucus, and he's one of the current chairpersons for SDC District 24. Clayton, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Nikki. And of course, thank you, Ben and Ahmad, for great presentations. And for everyone who's joined us on a Saturday, I'm going to keep my part probably 5 minutes. So then we can jump into questions because I've been watching the chat and there's some really great questions. And I really want to make sure folks can get to them. So I am going to be talking about what does this mean for Texas? Because I think we all know folks who are just for one reason or another are not swayed by the morality of the situation. I believe we all know folks like this. So this is kind of geared towards those folks about like, okay, so let's say you're not swayed for whatever reason. Well, what does it mean for us here in Texas? So first off, let's just do a big uniting factor that there is strong support for a permanent ceasefire. So a poll was done that asked, should the U.S. call for a ceasefire and de-escalation of violence in Gaza? The U.S. should leverage its close diplomatic relationship with Israel to prevent further violence and civilian deaths. A grand total, this was a national survey, and a grand total of 66% of all voters agreed with this statement. Breaking it down even more, 80% of Democrats support this. 57% of independents support this, and 56% of Republicans support this. And as a note that there was a Texas-specific poll done around Austin, San Antonio, which basically backs this up more or less, saying 73% of potential Democratic primary voters would like the candidate to support a ceasefire. So, we lived in a perfect democracy where our government represented us. This would just be a done deal. A ceasefire would already be called for. Unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. I mean, we are pushing for folks to, get more responsive to our needs. And this is just kind of a graph for the folks who are more visual. As you can see, is just the amount of support for a permanent ceasefire and de-escalation and to prevent deaths of civilians. And just for just general peace, it's just overwhelming, especially for our base. So what would it mean if our current administration just ignored the base? They just said, whatever, we're going to do what we want. Well, we're going to look into two different groups and see its electoral impact for Texas. We're going to look into the Muslim population of Texas and the youth population of Texas. So for Texas, there are between 313 to 420,000 Muslims living in Texas. And current data that I've seen suggests that upwards of 75% of them are Democrats. So a large majority of Texas Muslims are Democrat, or at least very likely are lean Democratic, and they are a very active and engaged group. So the statewide implications, if we lose this voting block, and we're only looking at just this voting block, we're not even counting progressives, we're not even counting youth at this point, just Texas Muslims. Well, Cruz won 2018 by only 220,000 votes. So with this, if we lose this critical voting block, I mean, I think it's going to be detrimental for us unseating Cruz in 2024. And a quick note to the whole audience, of the candidates who raised more than $1 million running in the Democratic primary, only one has called for ceasefire, and that is Roland Gutierrez. Just a quick side note. What does this mean for the Texas House? Well, so the data is incomplete. Everyone who's ever worked with VAN, that's the Voter Activation Network, knows there's a lot of missing demographic data, a lot of incorrect demographic data. But using various data points, we were able to create some projections about which Democrats would either just straight up lose their seat or would be really, really close, like way too close for comfort. And we have HD 70, Plaza, that's Collin County. We have HD 105, Terry Meza. HD 102, Ramos would be way too close for comfort. HD 76, Lalani, and HD 135, Representative Rosenthal. All those five folks are really great Democrats to have in the state house. They have done really great work, really, really great job. And we might lose all of them if Texas Muslims just don't go out and vote, if we lose that voting block over this issue. And as a quick reminder, we have to win 11 state house seats to regain power in Texas. So we lose these 5, then we'll probably lose the state house and continue losing the state house for the rest of this decade. So what about local seats? Well, basically the entire county of Fort Bend will be wiped off the map for us. I don't think we'll be able to win anything local or flip anything local. And there's been so much hard work put into Fort Bend County. There's so many activists who've done such a great job of really pushing for that county to turn blue. It is finally starting to flip blue. We're finally starting to reap the benefits of our work, and we could lose literally everything in that county. Other counties that will definitely suffer would be Collin County, Dallas County, Harris County, and Tarrant County. There's a lot more that would also have an impact. Travis County would have an impact as well. Just those 4 counties would be most impacted, and again, Fort Bend would just be wiped off the map for us. Other polls. So a poll of young voters, talking about young folks, basically 76% of them disapprove of the way things are going. They disapprove of the conflict. They really do not like the way the administration is handling it. They generally pro ceasefire. So 76 approve, 24% approve. And another poll commissioned by Fuente Latina found very similar results amongst the Latino youth voters. And I believe that poll was nationwide as well. Quick notes on how many young folks are in the state of Texas. So there are about 1.5 young voters who are Democrat or lean Democratic in Texas. Roughly 973,000 of them they'll vote in the general election. Some of them are very reliable, some of them a little less so. And around 770,000 of them are very reliable primary voters. So if we lose even a portion of that block, then we are in deep, deep trouble. So the main point I guess I really want to hit is that a ceasefire followed by the needed economic and political solutions to achieve peace, justice, and the self-determination for all people of Israel and Palestine. I mean, not only is it a moral calling, it may be a political necessity for us to keep our Big Tent coalition together. Because when 80% of our base wants this, speaking as an official of the Texas Democratic Party, I do believe it is our duty to deliver it. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Nikki.
Thank you, Clayton, for that look at the data and what's at stake for Democrats. I think it's also worth pointing out, because I live in Fort Bend, that we had a race, key races in 2022 before all these events of October 7 happened, and our county judge, who is a Democrat, kept his seat by just over 8,000 votes, running against a Republican, Trevor Nils, who is the brother of a very unpopular Republican congressman here in Fort Bend. So I think it's worth pointing out that while we have Fort Bend has turned blue, I don't feel super comfortable as someone who lives in Fort Bend saying it's reliably blue yet, because those races were too close for comfort even before these events. We're going to turn to questions now. And I think after questions, we'll do a quick poll again to see if there's been any change in people's responses, just as a matter of interest. We did have more questions for Professor Fleming than for Brother Emot, so if it's okay, I'm gonna actually start with one that Mr. Alexander asked. He wrote, Professor Fleming, can you touch upon the comments of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, who stated that Israel's right to self-defense doesn't apply to occupied territories because Israel doesn't claim to have been attacked by another state. He goes on to comment that to cite a source saying that an occupying power can't justify military force as self-defense in territory for which it's responsible as the occupant. The problem is Israel has never regulated its own behavior in the West Bank and Gaza as in accordance with occupation law. So could you address how occupation changes the analytical framework, since it's been argued that occupation takes over the police power of the occupied party, which would here be Gaza and the West Bank?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Alex. It's an open question in international law. So what she's talking about and what you're asking about emanates from the International Court of Justice's decision on the wall in the West Bank, a very famous international law case. And the majority there did say that you can't use self-defense as a basis for an armed attack in the territories you're occupying if you don't consider them a state, or because the fact that you are occupying them, you are responsible for them. It's like saying you're attacking yourself. Now, I have to reiterate that that is just an advisory opinion, and Justice Higgins in one of the concurring / dissents of that case gave an also compelling answer on this question. And if we take it out of Palestine, Israel, and look at it, say, I don't know, when the UK was along with the US in Iraq, if the UK is in charge of the entire southeast of Iraq as the occupying power following that armed conflict, if an insurgency started, that would be saying that the UK, because they're the occupier there, does not have the ability to react. I don't think we can go that far. Palestine also, I think we know where my allegiances lie, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. So you can't both be a state and have the benefits of the Rome Statute and being a member, even if not a full member of the UN, et cetera, but then claim you're not a state for the purposes of preventing Israeli self-defense. I understand the point that she's making, but treating it as a settled point of international law, I don't think is fair, because it comes from an advisory opinion where we had a split on that rationale. I know that's probably not a completely satisfactory answer, but I don't think any of the world players from a defense standpoint would accept the position that they would be unable to react to a terrorist group. We have the idea of lex ferenda law as it's becoming. This is how customary law comes into existence. Not all of it is well thought out. Not all of it makes a lot of sense. But it's analogous to the idea of attacking a non-state actor in a third state. So the US attacking ISIS in a state. We also have to be very clear about whether we're talking about the government of Gaza in Hamas, or we're talking about Hamas as a terrorist group. These are thorny questions. And I think I'd like to hear what Ahmad has to say about this, because Hamas is understood as the governing power in Gaza, but they haven't held an election in God knows how many years. And prior to October 7th, they were not very popular with the population of Gaza, although that's changing now. So treating Hamas, how you categorize Hamas matters in international law as well. Is it the government of Palestine, of a part of occupied Palestine? Is it not? Those sorts of things will change the calculus. But I'm afraid it's an open question, Alex. But I think the law is moving in the direction that the occupying power has the right to defend itself in the event of an attack onto its territory that is not considered occupied.
Oh, you're on mute, brother. There we go.
Yes, the issue of the election is hard to explain because they are under military occupation, so they have to get the approval of the Israeli government to allow them to do the election. At the same time, because the Palestinians consider Jerusalem part of the future Palestinian state, but Israel has annexed Jerusalem and consider it part of Israel. And our former president recognized that. So it's like it becomes a very tricky question, because the Palestinians want the Palestinian Authority wants the Palestinian in Jerusalem to be part of the election, but Israel rejects that. Only one time it allowed that, in 2006, and that's when Hamas won the majority of the Legislative Council. and that election was monitored by the European monitors and by the Jimmy Carter group that monitored the election, and they said it was fair and square. Now, Israel did not like that Hamas won. The United States did not like that Hamas has won. So Israel imposed the siege on Gaza. Since then, there has been no other elections. So I don't know under international law whether they still considered the government that's supposed to be in charge or not. I guess we will leave that to the professor.
Oh, I'm not going to pretend I can answer that question with any legitimacy between the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, the occupying power of Israel, who qualifies as the government is going to be context-driven for each question that we ask, I suppose. Legitimacy of platforms of these different groups also matters. That's as much as I can say about that.
Turn out to a question you may feel more comfortable answering because the definition is once again legal. So Christy asked, is there a citation for the law of armed conflict? Is it the Geneva Convention? Like, where does it come from?
So it's a huge corpus, a huge body of law. The primary understanding of it is from the Geneva Conventions 1 through 4, which are universally ratified. So it means they're applicable to every country. For non-international armed conflicts, we have what's known as the Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, just a convention in miniature. But then there's also a huge body of law that we consider customary international law, which grows out of the state practice of how international conflict is governed. It's both how countries act and the idea that they have to act in that way from a legal standpoint. So this is what I was talking about with the Israeli High Court, the Supreme Court in Israel. Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions provides a higher level of humanitarian protection for civilians. Now, Israel has not ratified that, and Netanyahu and Likud and his far-right coalition would very much like to ignore that. But the High Court of Israel itself has said that those humanitarian laws apply through custom. They're holding a line, maybe not the line that we would all like, but they're holding a line that's stronger than the one of the governing coalition now. So if you want, there's no citation where you can get everything. If you want to understand the international law of armed conflict, I would encourage you to look on the International Committee of the Red Cross's website. They are sort of the guardians of what is the status of international humanitarian law, and they put out commentaries on it. So you can look at everything from how and when you can target an individual, whether they're a combatant, whether they're a non-combatant, when a civilian becomes no longer a civilian, when they're taking active part in hostilities. There is an immense set of regulations related to it. So I'd be happy to point you in a more specific direction if you had a more specific question. But anything you want to know about international, the law of international armed conflict, I would in your own time, I'm happy to answer what I can, but in your own time, I would push you to the International Committee of the Red Cross and their commentaries.
Oh, thank you for that and for that resource. It's a good question. Going back to Brother Imad, could you help us better understand why there's a gap on the Palestinian map between the East and West? Why and how have Palestinians been cut off from one another?
Okay, sure. Let me share this map real quick. So this is Google Map. So when Israel was created, it took over 78 of Palestine, which is this area in the middle. The Gaza Strip on the left was all Palestinians, and a lot of refugees moved to the Gaza Strip. So it's a very densely populated area, and the Israelis did not take over until 1967. The West Bank also was supposed to be part of a Palestinian state, so Israel did not take over in 1948. So the distance between the West Bank and Gaza Strip is about 40 miles, and Palestinians are not allowed to cross Israel proper to go to the Gaza Strip. And of course, the people in Gaza cannot go to the West Bank or anywhere except with an Israeli military permit. Thinking about it as Americans, we could just have our passport in our hand and buy an airline ticket and go anywhere. But that's not the way it is in the Middle East. I have two brothers who live in Amman, Jordan, and they cannot go and see my mom in Ramallah, which is about 50 miles away. The only way for them to see my mom, who is 92 years old, is for my mom on her walker, get a taxi, go to the bridge, cross the bridge, and go to Amman, Jordan to see my brothers. There are 7 million Palestinian refugees who live in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Egypt, and some of them are inside the West Bank or Gaza Strip. Those Palestinian refugees cannot go back to their country. They cannot go back to their home. The refugees in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, they've been there for 75 years, living in Palestinian refugee camps, and they can't go back. Thank you for the question.
And of course, if your mother was in Gaza, she couldn't go to Amman at all, right?
No, she will have to get a special military permit for medical purposes, and sometimes they allow college students. And you will have to go through the Sinai Desert to Egypt, to Cairo, and from Cairo fly over Israel and go to Jordan, and from there go see my brothers. So life
Unbelievable.
is miserable for the Palestinians under Israeli military occupation.
Well, thank you for explaining that. We have another question about actually genocide. Would you be able to say that there's a genocide occurring of Gazans within the geographic bounds of Gaza? And I think especially given how Israel is pushing, residents of Gaza to move to the south and then also bombing the south. So I guess Professor Fleming, would you mind addressing that first from a legal point of view?
I mean, it's certainly arguable, right? I don't think that anyone could say that it's not a plausible argument. So genocide is a loaded term, and people get very antsy about using it. And we do have to remember this special intent, this dolus specialis is what it's called in law, that you have to meet not just the intention to kill these people, you have to have special intent to destroy as such the entire group. Now, when we look at the behavior, the conduct of the war, the fact that there is no civilian corridor, that there's no escape routes, that the instructions keep changing from north to south, that is compelling evidence, but it's circumstantial. When we look at the statements made by, for example, a defense minister, that contributes to the idea that these special and the dolus speciale, the higher level of intent is there to destroy the entire group, to wipe it from the map. Now, we have questions about whether the statements of these people can be attributed to the state. I think it's very clear that you can attribute the statements of the defense minister to the state. And even if not, the head of the government, Netanyahu, would have to disavow or disabuse himself of these beliefs. He has not done that. He's not in a political position to do that because he cannot maintain a coalition without holding fast to the far right of Israeli politics. So I think that a prima facie case can be made that genocide is occurring. I would be willing to say that.
Can you explain what prima facie means?
On its face. That's just the Latin for on its face. I don't have, I'm not in a position where I have all the evidence and I can make a complete legal determination on whether it happens at a very low level evidentiary standard. I'm confident to say that it wouldn't be thrown out of court because it hasn't met the basic minimums of a case. When we make these claims, we have to test them in a court of law or in some fora. And until those things are tested, they're not proven. But I think it's a plausible case. I think again, what I said earlier is if you want to try to make a decision on that, look at what the State Department has said with respect to the genocide in Xinjiang in China with the Uyghurs. Look at what the US State Department has said about the genocide of the Rohingya. Look at the factual comparisons in one and in the other, and then look at the facts on the ground in Gaza. And then you can make up your own mind about why it is the United States is willing to call a genocide in those two places and yet contribute no resources to them, and not call it that in Gaza and contribute billions of dollars of resources to the IDF and Quds.
I'm gonna move back to Brother Imad in a minute, but we also had a follow-up question related to the number of children that have died in Gaza. About 7,000 have died so far. Does that have a bearing on whether or not it's genocide?
The question for me or for the professor? I think for the professor.
Oh,
I mean, my
obviously it would be relevant, sure. That's one of the underlying acts is preventing births. One way to prevent births is to kill children. One way of forcibly transferring populations is to actually kill children. There's also circumstantial evidence. The fact that, over 100 bloodlines have been completely extinguished. That means that entire families, extended families, have been wiped from the earth in Gaza. No remaining members of these families whatsoever. Many of them often in single strikes. How you can make a calculus that any Hamas militant fighter is of enough military advantage that you can wipe out 35 members of a single family in the same strike is a calculus that I don't want to be a part of, and I don't want to think about. I think it's grotesque to even try to put it into legal language, to be completely honest. So obviously children deserve a higher and receive a higher level of protection under international law, everywhere except for in the United States, of course, because the United States, if we're going to be talking about bad actors, I should remind everyone that this is the only country on the face of the planet, including Israel and Palestine, that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So, yeah, I don't know if I fully answered that question, but.
We also raised more questions, but no, we appreciate the answer. Brother Imad, we're going to go back to you. If there's anything you'd like to address in the previous questions, please do so. We also have had some general questions asking if you feel like you can explain the role of Hamas in the, I guess, governance of Palestine, the Gaza political, military, and governmental, and whether they have a support or role in the West Bank.
So before October 7th, Hamas, according to the poll, Hamas was losing popularity in Gaza and in the West Bank. So if there would have been elections before October 7th, neither Hamas or Fatah would win the election. I think it would have been like an independent that does not belong to either organization. Because those two organizations, they have been in charge since 2006, 2007. Fatah controlling the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and Hamas controlling Gaza Strip. And they have not been agreeing together to form a government as one government to represent all Palestinians. And this is an excuse that the Netanyahu government has been given for not having any kind of peace negotiations. It's not that there are pressure on them to do it, and we haven't had any president to pressure the Israelis probably since 94, 95, the days of Bill Clinton. Since then, there hasn't been any pressure on them to really come to the table and negotiate a solution. But Hamas was losing ground before October 7 in Gaza. It was losing ground in the West Bank. Fatah was losing ground in the West Bank. So there has not been any polls after October 7th. But I would assume Hamas did gain some popularity between the Palestinian people because the Israelis have been killing the Palestinians for the last 75 years, and this is the first time Palestinians are attacking Israel. This has never happened before. So I would assume Hamas did gain some popularity, but at the same time, you have to think about it from the point of view of the Palestinian civilians. They are tired of being under siege. They are tired in not having enough food, enough jobs, medicine, schools. Imagine if for the young people in Gaza, for people under age 22, I think the unemployment rate is like 65%. Imagine you graduate from high school, you graduate from college and nothing to do. And you have to ask your parents for some allowance, or you have to, I don't know how else, can you get some money in an enclave where you can't leave, you can't go nowhere, there is no jobs, there is no food, there is no potential, nothing. So probably what happened on October 7, this might move things around and pressure the United Nations and the world to do something about the misery of the Palestinian people. If they don't do it, there might be some other things might happen like this, and that will pressure the world and hopefully pressure the Biden administration to do something about this military occupation of Palestine.
Let's be clear here, though, because we have to say that from a legal standpoint, I'm not making, this is what I was saying at the beginning. The law of armed conflict, the law of humanitarian law is not about the moral equivalency. So what Hamas did, taking hostages, raping, whatever, we've seen videos, we've heard evidence. I haven't, I'm not holding it, so I can't make any hard claims. Those are all crimes. Those are also war crimes. But there was preceding crimes. We have to understand that too. So what Ahmad is talking about is the apartheid that's being practiced on the Palestinian people. But if we compare it again to the apartheid in South Africa, we can't quite equate Hamas and the African National Congress either. I'm not saying one is right, one is wrong. That's not what we're trying to do here. We're talking about the law is only there for the methodologies of solving the problem. You're making a political decision if you decide to break international law regarding taking hostages, committing war crimes. That's a political decision. And you can feel however you want morally, whether that calculus is worth it to commit crimes in order to get what you're trying to achieve. I drive and I speed past the speed limit all the time. If I'm in a hurry, if the calculus for me makes sense, it doesn't mean I haven't committed a crime. So on both sides, we have political decisions being made. Those political decisions have no bearing on the legality of the implementation of those political decisions. So the choice of how you fulfill your political desires matters. And right now, neither side is covering themselves in glory, but we have very unequal arms on both sides. So I just want to make that clear. There's a distinction between political choices and legal consequences for your implementation of those political choices.
And I think this is a good time to maybe stop recording. So if anyone who wants to come off mute and ask questions they have remaining can do so.